But before we get to what she said, before we get to what happened next, you need to understand something about the woman who stood up. Because this story is not about bikers, not really. This story is about her. It has always been about her. And if you do not understand who Margaret Colton was before that Tuesday afternoon, you will never understand what she did or why it mattered. So let me take you back. 6 years before that day at the Rusty Spoon Diner, Margaret Colton buried her husband. Harold Colton had been a quiet man, a carpenter by trade, the kind of man who said more with his hands than he ever said with his mouth. He built the porch swing on the front of their house on Elm Creek Road the summer they moved in 1963. He built the bookshelves in the living room when Margaret started bringing home more books than the local library could hold. He built the raised garden beds in the backyard when she said she wanted to grow tomatoes. And he did not point out that she had never grown a single thing in her life. He just built them. And she grew the tomatoes. And they were terrible. And they laughed about it every summer for 40 years. Harold died on a Wednesday morning in December. Heart gave out. No warning, no long illness. Just a man sitting in his chair by the window with a cup of coffee that was still warm when Margaret found him. She handled the funeral arrangements herself, every detail. The flowers, the music, the suit he would wear the plot beside the old elm tree at Whitmore County Cemetery. Her children offered to help. Her son Darren called from Ohio. Her daughter Claire called from Arizona. Both of them said, "Mama, let us take care of it." And Margaret told them no. She told them their father had carried enough for this family, and she was not going to let his children carry the weight of putting him in the ground. That was her job. She had earned it. She had taught herself to drive at 53 when Harold's eyesight started going. Not because anyone suggested it, because she looked at the situation, understood what needed to happen, and she made it happen. She got behind the wheel of Harold's old Ford pickup on a Sunday morning, drove it up and down Elm Creek Road until she could make the turns without hitting the mailbox, and then she drove herself to the DMV on Monday and passed the test on the first try. She had fixed a burst pipe in the basement at 4 in the morning once because the plumber could not come until Tuesday, and she was not going to let her kitchen flood while she waited for a man with a wrench to show up on his schedule. She found a video at the library on basic plumbing. She watched it twice. She fixed the pipe. It held for 11 years. She stood at Harold's graveside in a black dress with her hands folded and her chin set, and she said goodbye to the man she had loved for 51 years. And when it was over, she drove herself home, alone. That is who Margaret Colton was. Not fragile, not helpless, not confused. After Harold passed, Margaret kept the routine. Tea every morning, library books stacked on the nightstand. Tuesdays and Thursdays at the Rusty Spoon Diner off Route 9, where she would order a pot of a chamomile tea with lemon and a slice of lemon cake and sit by the window for exactly 1 hour. She had been a school librarian for 34 years. She had raised 3 children in that house, 6 grandchildren, a good life, the kind that does not make headlines. She did not wallow. She did not quit. She was the kind of woman who believed that staying busy was the same as staying alive, and maybe she was right about that. For 3 years after Harold, she managed fine. More than fine. She repainted the kitchen herself, chose the color, bought the paint, taped the edges, did 2 coats because the first one looked uneven, and Margaret Colton did not do uneven. She joined a book club on Wednesday evenings at the county library. She read everything they assigned and then read 2 more books on top of it because she said the group moved too slowly. She even took a solo trip to visit Claire in Arizona, her first flight in 11 years. She packed her own bag, drove herself to the airport, navigated the terminals, and arrived in Tucson with a suitcase full of homemade preserves and a paperback she finished before the plane landed. She was not surviving. She was living. And then Garrett Pruitt started calling. Garrett was Margaret's nephew, her late sister, Ruth's boy. Because the truth was she was managing fine, but managing fine and being lonely are not the same thing. And Margaret Colton, for all her strength, for all her steel, was lonely. The house on Elm Creek Road had too many rooms and not enough noise And when your nephew calls after 10 years and says he wants to be part of your life again, you do not say no. You say, come on over. I will make coffee. And he came. Garrett Pruitt, mid-40s, slick hair, combed back, a watch that caught the light, a smile that arrived a half-second too quickly, and his wife Diane, blonde, polished, smelling like department store perfume, speaking in a voice that was sweet, the way certain things are sweet, like something sugary that has gone just slightly past its expiration. They brought a casserole. They offered to help with the yard. They asked about the gutters and the roof and whether the water heater was holding up. Margaret answered them honestly, the way she answered everything, directly, without suspicion, because she had spent her whole life believing that when family shows up, you open the door. The visits became regular. Every 2 weeks, then every week, Garrett would mow the lawn, Diane would bring groceries. They started taking Margaret to doctor appointments. They started asking about her medications, her sleep, her memory. Small questions, gentle questions. The kind that sounded like concern and felt like concern and looked from every possible angle exactly like what they claimed to be. But they were not concern. They were inventory. Margaret did not see it, not at first, maybe not even at second, because she was sharp, she was intelligent, she was nobody's fool, but she was also a woman who wanted to believe that the only family she had left on her sister's side had come back because they loved her. And wanting to believe something is the most dangerous thing in the world, when the people standing in front of you know exactly how to use that want against you. Gradually, the questions changed. What is the property worth? Now, do you think? Have you thought about what happens to all of this when you are gone? Have you considered putting arrangements in place just so the kids do not have to deal with the burden later? You know how these things can get complicated. Probate, taxes, legal fees. It would be so much easier if everything were already settled. And Margaret, sitting in her own kitchen, drinking tea she had made in her own kettle, in the house her husband built, with his own hands, began to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Doubt, not doubt about Garrett, not yet. Doubt about herself. Am I getting old? Am I missing something? Is he right? Should I be planning? That is how it starts. Not with force, not with threats, not with anything that leaves a mark. It starts with questions that make you question yourself. And once that seed is planted, once a person begins to wonder whether their own mind is reliable, the ground shifts beneath them so slowly they do not feel it moving until they are standing on nothing at all. Now let me tell you about Jolene Watts. Jolene had been waitressing at the Rusty Spoon for 12 years. She had started the year her daughter was born, picking up shifts between feedings, and she had never left. The money was not great. The hours were long. But Jolene had a gift, or maybe it was a curse. She could read people, not in any mystical way, nothing supernatural. She just paid attention. She watched the way people held their coffee cups and whether they made eye contact when they ordered. She noticed when a couple sat on the same side of the booth versus across from each other. She heard what people said, but more importantly, she heard what they were really saying underneath the words they used. She had seen first dates and divorce fights, bad news delivered over coffee, joy over cherry pie. She had watched a man propose to his girlfriend at table 7 and watched another man tell his wife he was leaving at table 4, both on the same Tuesday. 12 years behind that counter had given Jolene a library of human behavior that no university could match. And Jolene had been watching Margaret Colton for a long time. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, the same order: tea with lemon, lemon cake, a smile that reached her eyes, a question about Jolene's daughter, an hour by the window, then home. Jolene liked Margaret. There was something about the old woman that reminded Jolene of her own grandmother, who had been a school teacher in Knoxville and who had died with a crossword puzzle half finished on her nightstand because she refused to quit doing the things she loved right up until the end. Margaret had that same quality, that same refusal to surrender to age, that same quiet insistence on living fully in every room she walked into. But lately, something had changed. Margaret still came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She still ordered the tea and the cake. She still smiled, but the smile had shifted. It was thinner. It arrived later, and it left sooner, and the questions about Jolene's daughter had stopped. That was the detail that caught Jolene's attention, because Margaret Colton never forgot to ask about Lily. Never. It was the first thing she said every time she sat down. How is that little girl of yours? And when a woman who has asked about your daughter every week for 3 years suddenly stops asking, something is wrong. Something is taking up all the space inside her where other people used to fit. Jolene had started paying closer attention after that, watching Margaret's hands, watching her eyes, noticing the way she sometimes stared at her phone after it rang like she was trying to decide whether the thing in her hand was a lifeline or a trap. And then 3 days before that Tuesday with the bikers, Jolene heard something that changed everything. She had been clearing the booth directly behind Margaret, wiping down the table, stacking plates, moving slowly the way you move when you are trying to be invisible. And Margaret's phone had rung. She answered it, and the voice on the other end was loud enough to carry. It was Garrett, but he was not talking to Margaret. He was talking to someone else. Diane, probably. And Margaret had answered the call at the exact wrong moment, or maybe the exact right moment, because what came through that speaker was not meant for her ears. Once the doctor signs off, the house is ours. She will not be able to fight it. Everything is already in place. Tuesday at the diner, she signs. We file Wednesday morning. Done. Margaret's face did not change. That was the part that stayed with Jolene. The old woman heard those words, and her expression did not move. She just sat there, holding the phone, looking out the window at the parking lot where Harold used to pull in with his truck every Tuesday to pick her up before she learned to drive herself. She set the phone down. She picked up her tea. She took a sip, and Jolene saw her hand tremble for the first time in 3 years. Jolene had gone still behind that booth, cloth in her hand, not moving, not breathing. She had heard plenty of ugly things in 12 years of waitressing. People saying things in public they had no business saying. But this was different. This was not a careless remark. This was not gossip. This was a plan, calculated, patient, months in the making. A machine built piece by piece right under Margaret's nose while she served tea and read her library books and believed in the goodness of the people sitting across from her. A fake incompetency assessment. A doctor handpicked by Garrett. 2 evaluations already completed, rigged to conclude that Margaret could no longer manage her own affairs. Power of attorney documents designed to be signed that very Tuesday at the diner. A public place chosen deliberately so it would look voluntary, so it would look calm, so it would look like a sweet old woman making sensible arrangements with her devoted nephew. Everything above board, everything witnessed, everything legal on the surface, and underneath a theft so patient and so precise that by the time anyone noticed, it would already be done. Jolene carried that knowledge for 3 days. 3 days of pouring coffee and wiping counters and lying awake at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling of her apartment while her daughter slept in the next room. 3 days of asking herself what to do, call the police, and say what you overheard a phone call that was not a crime. Tell Margaret and watch the old woman's heart break in front of her. Tell someone at the county who, and how would she prove it? Jolene did not know what to do. But she knew that Tuesday was coming. And she knew that whatever happened in that diner when Garrett walked through that door, she could not stand behind that counter and do nothing. She just did not know yet what doing something would look like. And then Tuesday came. The sky was the color of old concrete, low clouds sitting on the hills like they had nowhere else to be. The smell of coffee and burnt toast drifting through the rusty spoon the way it always did, mixing with the soft clink of silverware and the murmur of voices that never rose above comfortable. The lunch crowd was thin, a few truckers at the counter, a retired couple near the window sharing a newspaper. A young mother cutting a grilled cheese sandwich in half for her little girl who was watching the parking lot with the kind of attention only children give to things adults have learned to ignore. Ordinary, quiet, the kind of Tuesday nobody remembers. Then the rumble started, low and deep, the kind of sound that travels through the floor for you hear it with your ears. It came from the road first, then the gravel lot growing louder with each second. 6 motorcycles, one by one, each engine a separate voice in a chorus that shook the windows and rattled the coffee cups on the counter. The little girl stopped chewing and looked at her mother. The truckers put down their forks. The retired couple folded their newspaper. And without a word being said, every single person in that diner felt the shift. The air changed weight. The room got smaller. The ordinary Tuesday cracked open, and something else walked through. 6 men filed in through the front door, leather cuts over heavy shoulders, road-worn boots on the linoleum, arms that looked like they had been built in a junkyard and tested in places most people only read about. They moved through the diner the way weather moves through a valley, without asking permission, without adjusting to the space. The space adjusted to them. They took up the long booth in the back, sat down hard, ordered without looking at the menu. Loud voices, direct, taking up exactly as much room as they wanted and not 1 inch less. The one at the head of the table was the biggest, not tallest, biggest. The kind of big that starts in the shoulders and does not stop. Silver-streaked beard, a face carved from decades of wind and road, and things that do not get talked about in polite company. His leather cut carried a patch over the chest that read Iron Wolf, and beneath it smaller a name, Stone, Colt Hargrove. They called him Stone because that is what he was, immovable, unreadable, present in a way that most people are not present, like a man who had learned long ago that the only thing you can control in this world is whether or not you leave. He had been riding since he was 19. He had buried 2 brothers in the club. He had done a stretch at Riverbend State Penitentiary for something he did not talk about, and nobody asked about because the men who rode with him understood that some doors stay closed for a reason. He had seen things that would hollow out most men. He had done things that kept him awake on certain nights when the road was too quiet and his own thoughts were too loud. But he was here now, at a diner in rural Tennessee, eating eggs and drinking black coffee on a Tuesday afternoon. And he had not expected what was about to happen. None of them had. Most people in that diner kept their eyes down. The truckers studied their plates. The retired couple suddenly found the newspaper fascinating again. The young mother pulled her daughter slightly into her side without even realizing she was doing it. A couple of customers moved their purses a little closer. One man near the register shifted his weight like he was calculating the distance to the door. Nobody looked at the bikers directly. Nobody wanted to be seen looking. But one person did not look away. At a corner table barely visible behind a ceramic mug and a half-eaten slice of lemon cake sat Margaret Colton. 89 years old, white hair pinned up neat, floral blouse with a small brooch Harold had given her on their 30th anniversary. Hands wrapped around that mug like she was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping. She was trembling, not from cold, not from age, from the thing that had been building inside her for months. The fear she had carried alone because nobody believed her. The knowledge she had gained 3 days ago when she heard her nephew's voice say the words that confirmed everything she had suspected but could not prove. The understanding clear and terrible that the man walking through that door in 15 minutes was going to take everything Harold had built, everything she had kept, everything she had earned across 51 years of marriage and 6 years of grief and 89 years of a life lived with her hands in the dirt and her back straight and her word as good as anyone's. Margaret set down her mug. She looked across the diner at those 6 rough, road-hardened men. She looked at their leather and their patches and their arms and their faces, and she saw what everyone else in that room was afraid of. And she was afraid too. But Margaret Colton had learned something in 89 years that most people never learn at all. Fear and courage are not opposites. They are neighbors. They live in the same house, and the door between them is always unlocked. You just have to be willing to walk through it. She gripped the edge of the table for balance. Her knuckles whitened. She pushed herself up slowly, deliberately, the way a woman stands when she has made a decision that cannot be unmade. And here is what you need to understand about that decision. Margaret Colton had spent 3 days thinking about this moment. 3 days since she heard Garrett's voice on that phone. 3 days of lying awake in the house on Elm Creek Road, staring at the ceiling Harold had replastered in 1987, running through every option she had. Call the police and tell them what? That her nephew was going to bring her papers to sign. That was not a crime. Not yet. Not until the papers were signed and filed, and it was already too late. Hire a lawyer. With what money Harold's pension covered the mortgage and the groceries and the electric bill, there was nothing left for legal fees, nothing left to fight a battle that might take months. Call Darren, call Claire. She had tried. She had called them both. She had told them about the visits, about the questions, about the feeling in her stomach that something was wrong. And they had said what children say when they are too far away to see what is happening up close. They said she was probably worrying too much. They said Garrett was probably just being thorough. They said she should be grateful someone was looking out for her. Grateful. That word had landed in Margaret's chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She could not go to the police because there was no crime yet. She could not go to a lawyer because she could not afford one. She could not go to her children because they did not believe her. She could not go to Pastor Whitmore at First Methodist on Cedar Street because what would she say that her nephew was being too nice? There was no one. There was no system. There was no safety net designed for a woman standing exactly where she was standing. So Margaret Colton did something else. She prayed. She got down on her knees beside the bed she had shared with Harold for half a century, and she prayed the way she had always prayed, not for miracles, not for angels, for practical things, for something she could use. She asked God to send her someone who was not afraid of Garrett Pruitt. And then she got dressed. She pinned up her hair. She put on the floral blouse with Harold's brooch. She drove to the Rusty Spoon Diner, and 6 motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot. Margaret Colton did not believe in coincidence, but she believed in answers. And when she looked at those 6 men walking through that door, she did not see what everyone else saw. She did not see danger. She did not see trouble. She saw exactly what she had asked for: people who could not be bought, people who could not be intimidated, people who could sit in a room and not be moved. And so she stood up, and she walked across that floor. She walked past the empty tables, past the counter, past the jukebox that had not worked since 2009. She walked all the way to the back booth where 6 men sat with their coffee and their eggs and their leather and their silence. The sound of her shoes was the only noise in the room. Low heels on hard tile. Click, click, click. Every head turned. Jolene froze behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand. The truckers stopped mid-bite. The little girl watched with wide eyes from her mother's side. She stopped. Stone looked up. His eyes were the color of a winter sky before snow. Unreadable. Waiting. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Just present. The way a mountain is present. Not going anywhere. Not coming toward you. Just there. Margaret Colton looked at him. She held his gaze. Her chin was not trembling anymore. It was set. There was a quiet dignity in her that cut right through the diner noise and the coffee smell and the years of hard road etched into his face. A dignity that did not ask for permission and did not apologize for existing. She opened her mouth, and in a voice barely above a whisper, Margaret Colton asked the question that nobody in that diner would ever forget. Can you pretend to be my son today? Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Because 20 minutes from now, a man in a pressed shirt was going to walk through that door carrying papers designed to steal everything Margaret Colton had ever owned. And the only thing standing between her and that man was a table full of strangers who had every reason to walk away. Stone looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved over her face, reading her. The way men read each other on long roads quickly, completely, without asking questions they already know the answers to. She held his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not explain herself. She just stood there, 5'3", 89 years old, trembling hands and a spine made of something that does not bend. And something shifted behind those eyes. Something that had been locked away for a long time. Something that recognized something in her that he had not expected to find in a roadside diner on an ordinary Tuesday. He looked at the men around the table. Hatch, Tuck, Dutch, the two others, and something passed between them, the way things pass between men who have ridden long roads together and buried brothers and sat in silence through nights that never seem to end. No words, just understanding. The kind of understanding that does not need language because it lives somewhere deeper than language can reach. Stone turned back to Margaret Colton, and he asked her one question. His voice was low, graveled, like tires on a dirt road. "You hurt." "Not yet," she said, "but I will be, unless you help me." Stone looked at her for another long beat. His jaw shifted once the way a man's jaw shifts when he is deciding something that matters. Then he slid over in the booth, made room, and he said in a voice gentle enough to surprise even himself words that rearranged the air in that diner the way a single match rearranges a dark room. "Sit down, Ma. What kind of son lets his mother stand?" Margaret Colton sat. She lowered herself into that booth beside a man she had never met, surrounded by 5 others she had never seen, and something happened to her that she had not felt in a very long time. The trembling stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. It stopped the way a held breath stops when you finally let it go. All at once, complete. The table changed instantly. One of the bikers, a younger guy with a patchy beard and restless eyes, a man they called Tuck, waved Jolene over and ordered a round of milkshakes. Said it like he was ordering for a family reunion. "Chocolate for me, vanilla for my brother over there, and whatever she wants." He pointed at Margaret with a grin so wide and so sudden that it looked like it had been waiting inside his face for exactly this moment. Another biker, a thick-necked man with tattoos climbing both forearms, pulled out his phone and started flipping through photos. He turned the screen toward Margaret and showed her a picture of his dog, a lopsided mutt with one ear up and one ear down, like they had been family for years, and this was just another Tuesday catching up. Dutch, the gray-haired one, at the end of the table, the one who had barely spoken since they walked in, the one whose silence was not empty but full, he looked at Margaret and asked her a question so ordinary, it nearly broke Jolene's heart from behind the counter. "You want the rest of my pie?" Nobody announced what they were doing. Nobody coordinated it. It just happened. The way it happens with people who understand instinctively what a moment requires. Loud voices, easy laughter, the sound of forks on plates, the kind of noise a family makes when they are comfortable with each other, when the silence between the words is as warm as the words themselves. And Margaret Colton, sitting among them with a milkshake she had not ordered and a warmth she had not expected, felt something she had not felt since Harold died. Safe. She took a long sip of her tea, set it down, folded her hands on the table the way she used to fold them when she stood at the front of the school library and addressed a room full of restless children. Calm, organized, in control. And then she told them everything. Not the way a victim tells a story, not with tears, not with panic. Margaret Colton told that story the way a general briefs a room before battle. Clear facts, specific details, a timeline that made the situation impossible to misunderstand. She told them about Garrett's calls, how they started warm and concerned and gradually became something else, how the questions shifted from her health to her house, How the visits became regular, then frequent, then unavoidable. How Diane always smelled like department store perfume and spoke in that voice that was too sweet, like something that had turned. She told them about the doctor, a man she had never seen before, a man Garrett had chosen. Two appointments, both of which Garrett had driven her to, both of which had felt wrong in a way she could not explain until later. The doctor had asked her strange questions. What year is it, Margaret? Can you count backward from 100 and by sevens? Can you remember these three words I'm about to say? He wrote things down on a clipboard she was never allowed to read. He spoke to Garrett in the hallway afterward quietly with the door half closed, and when they came back into the room, they were both smiling the way people smile when they have agreed on something behind your back. She told him about the papers. Garrett had called yesterday, told her he was bringing documents to the diner. Estate management, he called it, a protective arrangement, something to make sure her affairs were in order. He said it was for her own good. He said it was what Harold would have wanted. And that was the moment Margaret's voice changed. Just slightly, a tightening at the edges. Because invoking Harold's name to justify stealing Harold's house was the one thing Garrett had done that Margaret could not forgive. Everything else she could understand, even if she hated it. The greed, the patience, the manipulation. Those were human failings. Ugly, but human. But using the name of a dead man to rob his widow. That was something else entirely. She told him about her children, how she had called Darren in Ohio, how she had called Claire in Arizona, how she had tried to explain what was happening and they had told her she was worrying too much, that Garrett was being thorough, that she should be grateful. She paused after that word, let it sit on the table like a stone. Then she looked at Stone with those clear eyes, and she said the thing that made Jolene's throat close up behind the counter. I could not go to the police because there is no crime yet. I could not go to a lawyer because I cannot afford to fight what he has built. And I could not go to my kids because they think I am overreacting. She paused. So I prayed this morning. I asked God to send me someone who was not afraid of him. She looked at the leather and the patches and the road-hard faces around that table, and then you walked in. The booth was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just full. The way a room gets full when something true has been spoken and everyone present knows they have just been handed something that requires a decision. Stone said nothing. He looked at his coffee. Then he looked at Margaret. Then he looked at Hatch, the compact, quiet biker to his left, the one who had said exactly 4 words since they sat down. Hatch gave one small nod. That was all. One nod. And it carried the weight of every mile they had ever ridden together. And then Jolene Watts did the thing she had been carrying in her chest for 3 days. She walked out from behind the counter. She crossed the diner floor. She leaned down close to Stone and she whispered. She told him about the phone call she had overheard. The exact words. Once the doctor signs off, the house is ours. She will not be able to fight it. Everything is already in place. Tuesday at the diner, she signs. They file Wednesday morning. She told him about the fake assessments, about the doctor Garrett had handpicked, about how everything was designed to look voluntary. A public place. Witnesses who would see a sweet old woman signing papers with her devoted nephew. Everything legal on the surface. She told him all of it. 3 days of carrying that stone in her chest, and she set it down at that table beside Margaret Colton and 6 men in leather who had not asked for any of this, but were already in it up to their shoulders. Stone did not react right away. He sat very still while Jolene spoke. Eyes forward, face unreadable. His coffee cup was still in his hand. When Jolene finished and straightened back up, he set the cup down slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets something down when he is making sure his hands stay steady. His eyes hardened. Something moved behind them. Something old. Something that had teeth. The kind of anger that does not shout and does not swing. The kind that settles into the bones and stays there quiet and permanent like concrete setting. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him. And then she said something that none of the bikers expected. something that shifted the entire dynamic of that table and made it clear once and for all that this woman was not a passenger in her own rescue. She said, "I have a plan, but I need hands." Stone's eyebrows moved, just slightly, just enough to show that he had not expected those words from an 89-year-old woman in a floral blouse. Margaret continued. Her voice was calm, measured. The voice of a woman who had spent 3 days thinking this through, lying awake in the house Harold built, running scenarios the way she used to organize a library catalog. Methodically, completely. In your group, she said, is there anyone who knows a doctor you trust, a real doctor? Someone with no connection to my nephew. Stone looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I know a retired physician in Nashville. He rides with us on weekends. Can he do a cognitive evaluation? Margaret asked. A real one, independent, something that would hold up. Stone nodded slowly. He can. Margaret folded her hands tighter. Good. And does anyone here know the number for the Tennessee Department of Human Services, the Adult Protective Services Division? There was a beat of silence. Dutch reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. He typed something, scrolled. Then he looked up at Margaret and read a number off the screen. Margaret nodded once. Then she said, here is what I need. I need someone to call that doctor and schedule me for an evaluation tomorrow morning. A clean assessment, my full consent, no pressure, no coaching, just a legitimate report from a physician who has never spoken to Garrett Pruitt or anyone Garrett Pruitt has ever hired. She paused. Then she continued, and I need someone to call Adult Protective Services. An anonymous tip, specific enough to open a formal investigation, specific enough to flag the doctor Garrett used and raise questions about both of his assessments, specific enough to trigger a mandatory hold on any power of attorney filings involving me for the next 30 days. She looked around the table. That gives me time, she said. Time to get a real lawyer. Time to get my children here. Time to undo what he has spent months building. The table was silent. Every man at that booth was looking at Margaret Colton with an expression that Jolene, watching from behind the counter, could only describe one way. Respect. Not pity, not sympathy, not the soft, condescending concern that people so often give to the elderly, the kind that says, I will take care of this for you because you cannot take care of it yourself. Respect. The real kind. The kind you give to someone who has read the entire board and knows exactly which pieces need to move. Stone stood up from the booth. He looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. And something passed between them that did not need words. An agreement. A contract written in eye contact and sealed in the understanding that what was about to happen was not his decision. It was hers. He was the instrument. She was the hand. He walked outside. The gravel crunched under his boots. The wind was coming off the road, carrying the smell of diesel and cut grass and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle from somewhere beyond the tree line. He stood beside his motorcycle and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. James Calloway in Nashville, retired internist. Rode with the club on weekends. Owed Stone a favor that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a night on a back road outside Murfreesboro that neither of them ever spoke about. Stone told him what he needed. Calloway did not hesitate. Tomorrow morning, 8 sharp, he would drive to Whitmore County himself. The second call was to the Tennessee Department of Human Services, Adult Protective Services Division. Stone did not give his name. He gave details. The name Margaret Colton, the address on Elm Creek Road, the name Garrett Pruitt, the name of the doctor which Margaret had provided from memory without hesitation because Margaret Colton forgot nothing. He described the 2 assessments. He described the documents that had been prepared. He described the pattern, patient, deliberate, designed to circumvent a competent woman's autonomy under the cover of family concern. The woman on the other end of the line asked him to hold. When she came back, she gave him a confirmation number and told him that a mandatory hold would be placed on any power of attorney filings involving Margaret Colton for 30 days pending investigation. Stone wrote the number on his hand. He walked back inside. He sat down. He showed Margaret the number. She read it and nodded once and tucked the information away in her mind, the way a librarian shelves a book, in its proper place, ready to be retrieved when needed. And then they waited. 15 minutes, Margaret had said. 15 minutes before Garrett Pruitt walked through that door. So they waited. And while they waited, Tuck told a story about his dog that made Margaret laugh. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere deep and catches you by surprise. Dutch refilled her tea from the pot Jolene brought over without being asked. Hatch, who had barely spoken all afternoon, leaned over and said something quietly to Margaret that nobody else heard. Whatever it was, she patted his arm gently and said thank you. They looked like family. They sounded like family. And when that door opened and the bell above it jangled and Garrett Pruitt walked into the Rusty Spoon Diner, that is exactly what he saw. Garrett Pruitt was the kind of man who walked into a room like he already owned it. Mid-40s, tailored shirt, hair swept back neatly, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm the way a man carries something he considers important. He had the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had practiced the words in his car on the drive over, who had told himself this was just business, just paperwork, just a formality. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was actually for her own good, that Margaret was getting older, that the house was too much for her, that he was simply being practical, that Harold would have understood, that anyone looking at the situation objectively would see that Garrett Pruitt was doing the responsible thing. That is what he had told himself, and maybe he believed it. Maybe that was the worst part. He scanned the diner, found Margaret, and froze. 6 bikers, 1 booth. His aunt sitting comfortably in the middle of them, a milkshake in front of her, laughing at something the young one with the patchy beard had just said. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright, her hand resting on the forearm of the biggest man at the table like she had known him her entire life. Now here is what flickered across Garrett Pruitt's face in that moment. Confusion first, because he knew Margaret's children. He knew Darren was in Ohio and Claire was in Arizona. He knew there was no son, no brother, no male relative who looked anything like the man sitting beside his aunt with a silver-streaked beard and a leather cut that read Iron Wolf. Garrett knew Margaret's family tree better than she might have guessed because Garrett had studied it the way a man studies a map before a robbery. He knew every branch, every name, every distance. But knowing and saying are different things. And Garrett Pruitt looked at those 6 men and he understood instantly and completely that challenging the story Margaret was about to tell would mean calling her a liar in front of a table full of men who had already decided she was telling the truth. Men who did not look like they responded well to that kind of accusation. Men whose silence was louder than anything Garrett had prepared for. So he swallowed what he knew. He walked over. He smiled that rehearsed smile. Aunt Margaret, I did not know you had company. He looked at the bikers with a kind of expression that tried to be polite and landed somewhere between uneasy and dismissive. The smile of a man who is used to controlling rooms and has just walked into one he does not control. Margaret Colton looked up at her nephew, and she smiled. Not the thin smile Jolene had been seeing lately, not the worried smile, the real one, the one that had steel underneath it. Oh, it is just family, she said brightly. And then she patted Stone's forearm, the way a mother pats a son she is proud of, casually, possessively, like it was the most natural thing in the world. You remember my boy, do you not? Stone extended a hand across the table. Slowly, his grip Garrett would discover was considerable. The kind of handshake that communicates something specific without saying a word. The kind that holds on just a fraction of a second longer than comfortable. Good to finally meet you, Stone said. His voice was level, warm in a way that was somehow more unsettling than cold. Mom talks about you. A lot. The word mom hung in the air. It occupied space. It changed the temperature of the table. The other bikers were watching Garrett the way road-tested men watch something they have already figured out. Quiet, calm, immovable, not aggressive, not threatening, just present in a way that made it impossible to pretend they were not there. Garrett recalibrated. Jolene could see it happening behind his eyes. The quick rewrite, the adjustment. He pulled out a chair and sat across from them. He set the leather portfolio on the table. He straightened his shirt. He put his hands flat on the surface like a man grounding himself before a meeting that has already gone off script. He had not planned for witnesses. He definitely had not planned for these witnesses. He was used to control in rooms, board meetings, family dinners, conversations with doctors he had handpicked. He was used to being the smartest person at the table, the one with the paperwork, the one with the plan. He was not used to sitting across from men who did not care how expensive his watch was. I just need a few minutes with Aunt Margaret to go over some paperwork. His voice had dropped half a register. Efficient now, businesslike. Sure, said Stone. He leaned back, crossed his arms. What kind of paperwork? It is a private family matter. We are family, said Tuck from the end of the table. He said it with a grin, casual, like the most obvious thing in the world. Garrett looked around the table. He looked at Margaret. She looked back at him with those clear, sharp eyes. The same eyes that had cataloged 10,000 books and raised 3 children and stared down a burst pipe at 4 in the morning without flinching. And for the first time, something crossed Garrett Pruitt's face that was not confidence. He tried again. He slid the portfolio slightly toward Margaret. He started talking. Routine estate management, protective arrangement, her best interests, long-term planning. The phrases came out smooth and practiced the language of a man who had spent weeks selecting exactly the right words to make theft sound like tenderness. And Margaret Colton let him talk. She sat quietly. She listened. She let him lay his cards on the table, one by one, the way she used to let children in the library finish their excuses for overdue books before she responded. And when he was done, when the silence settled, Margaret spoke. What is the doctor's name? Garrett? Her voice was calm, conversational. The way you might ask someone to pass the salt. Garrett blinked. He told her. Margaret nodded slowly. That is strange, she said, because I did not choose that doctor. You did. Both times. Garrett's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Margaret continued. Did you bring me a lawyer, Garrett? Someone to explain these papers to me? Or did you only bring a lawyer for yourself? The table went very still. Garrett's hand was on the portfolio. His fingers pressed against the leather. He said that he did not think a lawyer was necessary, that the documents were straightforward, that he could explain everything. Tuck leaned forward. Had she agreed to these evaluations, or were they your idea? Garrett looked at Tuck, then at Stone, then back at Margaret. Dutch leaned forward and asked in a voice that was so calm it was almost gentle. What firm is that doctor affiliated with? Garrett said he did not see how that was relevant. Dutch looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The kind of moment that has weight, the kind that makes the air heavier. I think it is, Dutch said. They were not lawyers, but they asked like men who had spent years reading people and reading rooms and knowing when something was not right. Every question was calm. Every question was specific. And each one landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, impossible to ignore. Garrett's script was coming apart one thread at a time. The carefully constructed framework he had built the narrative where he was the responsible nephew and Margaret was the aging aunt who needed protection. It was unraveling in front of him, and the people pulling the threads were not the kind of people he knew how to manage. Anything involving my mother, Stone said, setting his coffee cup down with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, involves me. Garrett sat with his hands flat on the portfolio. His jaw was tight. The confidence that had walked through the door with him was leaking out through every crack these questions had opened. But he was not done yet. Men like Garrett Pruitt do not surrender easily. They recalculate. They adjust. They find another angle. He pushed the portfolio across the table toward Margaret one last time. He said quietly that she needed to sign, that it was for her own protection, that he was only trying to help, that this is what Harold would have wanted, and that was his mistake. His hands were still flat on the table, but his fingers were pressing harder now, white at the knuckles. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, to find one more angle, one more piece of language that might move this immovable woman. But before he could speak, Stone reached over. He picked up the portfolio from under Margaret's folded hands. He held it for a moment, looking at it the way a man looks at something that confirms what he already knew. Then he tore it in half, slowly, deliberately. One clean tear, then another, then another. The sound of tearing paper was the only noise in the Rusty Spoon diner. The trucker stopped talking. Jolene stopped moving behind the counter. The retired couple by the window leaned in slightly without realizing they were doing it. The little girl watched with her mouth open and her grilled cheese forgotten in her hand. Garrett Pruitt stared at the torn papers. Months of careful preparation becoming confetti on a laminate tabletop. "Those are legal documents," he said. His voice was rising for the first time. "You can print more," Stone said. He leaned back in the booth. Calm, absolute. But here is what mattered. Stone had not torn those papers on his own authority. He had not made that decision. Margaret had made the decision. Margaret had said the words. Margaret had looked her nephew in the eye and refused. The tearing was punctuation, an exclamation point at the end of Margaret Colton's sentence. And Margaret Colton was not finished. Stone reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. He set it on the table face up. On the screen was a confirmation number, 8 digits, a reference code from the Tennessee Department of Human Services Adult Protective Services Division. He slid the phone across the table toward Margaret because this was not his moment. Margaret Colton picked up the phone. She looked at the number on the screen. She read it once the way a librarian reads a catalog reference, confirming it against what she already knows. Then she set the phone down directly in front of Garrett, and she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 34 years commanding the attention of roomfuls of children simply by speaking clearly and expecting to be heard. "My son called Adult Protective Services this morning," she said. "A formal report has been filed. Every power of attorney filing involving my name has been frozen for 30 days pending investigation." She paused. Let the words settle. "And tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I have an appointment with an independent physician, a board-certified internist from Nashville. A man I chose, not you. He will conduct a full cognitive evaluation with my complete consent, and his report will be submitted to the state alongside the 2 assessments your doctor filed." She folded her hands on the table, the same hands that had trembled around a ceramic mug less than an hour ago. They were perfectly still now. "So if your doctor's work is honest, Garrett, there should be nothing to worry about." Should there? The diner did not make a sound. Garrett Pruitt looked at the phone on the table. He looked at the confirmation number glowing on the screen, and his face went through several things quickly, one after another, like weather systems crossing the same stretch of sky. Anger first, the hot, instinctive anger of a man whose carefully laid plans have been detonated by someone he underestimated. His nostrils flared, his jaw clenched tighter. For a fraction of a second, something dangerous moved behind his eyes. Then calculation, the quick cold arithmetic of a man running numbers. How much does she know? How much can she prove? Is there still a way to salvage this? Then panic, brief but visible. A flash of it across his forehead in the sudden loosening of his hands, in the way his eyes darted to the door and back, and then finally recognition. The slow, cold recognition of a man who has just realized that the room he walked into is not the room he thought it was. That the old woman in the floral blouse sitting across from him, the woman he had driven to appointments and brought casseroles and spoken about in soft, concerned tones to doctors and lawyers And his wife, that woman, had been 3 steps ahead of him. Not because she was lucky, not because someone had saved her, but because she had sat alone in her house on Elm Creek Road for 3 days and built a counterattack piece by piece the way she built everything in her life, carefully, completely, without asking for permission. Margaret watched it all cross his face. She watched the anger and the calculation and the panic and the recognition, the way she might watch a storm pass through the valley outside her kitchen window, with patience, with distance, without fear. Then she said the last thing she would ever say to Garrett Pruitt. "My son takes very good care of me, Garrett. He always has." And the way she said it, the way the word son landed on that table with all the weight of a truth that had been manufactured less than an hour ago and had somehow become more real than anything Garrett had built in 6 months, that was the thing that ended it. Not the phone call, not the confirmation number, not the investigation or the independent evaluation or the frozen filings. Those were mechanics. Those were tools. What ended it was a look in Margaret Colton's eyes when she said that word, son, because she meant it. Somehow, impossibly, in the space of less than an hour, she meant it. And Garrett could see that she meant it. And that was the thing he could not fight. You cannot fight what is real when everything you have is built on what is false, the diner erupted. It started with the truckers. One of them, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt who had been watching the whole thing from the counter with his fork suspended in the air for the last 5 minutes, set his fork down and started clapping. Slow at first, heavy hands coming together with the kind of deliberate rhythm that says, "I saw what just happened, and I want you to know I saw it." The retired couple by the window joined in. The woman first, her small hands moving quickly, her eyes bright. Her husband a beat behind, nodding as he clapped the way men of a certain age nod when they have witnessed something that restores a piece of their faith in how the world is supposed to work. The young mother clapped with one hand against her thigh because her other arm was around her daughter. But the little girl clapped with both hands above her head, the way small children do when they are not sure what they are celebrating, but can feel that it matters. Jolene pressed both hands together behind the counter. Hard. Her eyes were bright and her throat was tight, and she was pressing her palms together, not just to applaud, but to hold herself steady, because 3 days of carrying that secret in her chest had finally been set down, and the relief of it was almost more than she could stand. The cook, a man named Pete, who had worked the grill at the Rusty Spoon for 9 years and had never once left his station during service, leaned out through the kitchen window to see what the noise was about. He did not clap, but he smiled, a slow, wide, real smile, the kind you cannot fake, the applause built, spontaneous, unrehearsed, the kind that does not know it is applauding until it is already happening. Garrett Pruitt gathered the torn papers from the table without looking at anyone. He stacked the pieces mechanically. He stood. He straightened his shirt the way a man straightens his shirt when he needs something to do with his hands. He did not look at Margaret. He did not look at his stone. He did not look at anyone. He turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps were quick, clipped, the footsteps of a man who has lost something important and wants to be out of the room where he lost it before anyone else can see what his face is doing. The bell above the door jangled once as he pushed through it, the sound of his car starting, the sound of his tires on the gravel, and then nothing, just the fading hum of an engine disappearing down Route 9. Garrett Pruitt drove out of the parking lot of the Rusty Spoon Diner, and he never came back. He did not call Margaret. He did not write. He did not send Diane with casseroles or concerned questions or sweet voice suggestions about the house. He simply vanished from Margaret Colton's life the way a shadow vanishes when you turn on the light, completely, permanently, as if the thing casting it had never been there at all. The investigation that followed found significant irregularities in the doctor's 2 assessments. The questions used in both evaluations were not standard diagnostic tools. The scoring methodology did not match accepted clinical protocols. The doctor's notes contained conclusions that were inconsistent with the patient's actual responses. The state medical board opened a separate inquiry. The power of attorney filing was permanently blocked. Garrett and Diane quietly dropped all contact within the month. Margaret Colton's real children drove home. Darren came from Ohio. 12 hours in the car. He pulled into the driveway on Elm Creek Road on a Thursday evening and sat in his truck for 10 minutes before he walked to the front door, because he needed that long to figure out what to say to a mother he should have listened to and did not. Claire flew in from Arizona. She took the first flight she could get, which meant a connection through Atlanta, and a 3-hour layover that she spent in a plastic chair at the gate staring at her phone and reading the text messages Margaret had sent over the past 3 months. Messages she had dismissed. Messages she had responded to with reassurances. "It is probably nothing, Mama. Garrett is just being thorough. You should be grateful someone is looking out for you." Grateful. Claire read that word on her own screen and felt something move through her that was not quite shame and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two of them. A place with no name and no exit. She sat at her mother's kitchen table that evening and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steady, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand while Margaret set a kettle on the stove. Darren stood by the counter, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He said, "I should have listened." He said it twice. The second time he said it quieter than the first, like the words hurt more the closer they got to a whisper. Margaret made them both tea. She set the cups down. She sat across from her children, and she said in the same calm, clear voice she had used in that diner, "It is over now," and it was. But what happened after that, after the investigation, and the blocked filings, and the children coming home, that is the part of this story that nobody expects. 6 bikers rode Margaret Colton home that afternoon. A slow convoy down Elm Creek Road, motorcycles rumbling softly past the old oak trees and the mailboxes and the yards where neighbors stood on their porches and watched with expressions they could not quite sort out. They checked her locks. They looked at the windows. They fixed the back porch step that had been loose for 2 years, the one Margaret had been meaning to get to and never had. One of them mowed the lawn without being asked and was back on his bike before Margaret could even get to the front door to offer him a glass of water. Before they left, Stone handed Margaret a prepaid phone with one number saved in it. His. "You need anything," he said, standing at her front door with his hands in his pockets and his motorcycle idling at the curb. "Anything. You call." She called twice that first month. The first time because the furnace was making a noise she did not recognize, a clicking that started sometime after midnight and would not stop. Stone answered on the second ring. He sent Tuck over the next morning. Tuck spent an hour in the basement and came back upstairs with grease on his forearms and a diagnosis that the furnace needed a new ignition module, which he returned the following day to install. He would not take money for it. Margaret tried twice. He shook his head both times and said family does not charge family. The second time she called, it was a Wednesday evening. The house was too quiet and she had made too much soup. She did not say that exactly. She said she was just checking in. But Stone heard what she was really saying, the way men like him hear things. Not the words. The spaces between the words. He picked up. He stayed on the phone with her for 40 minutes, mostly listening. She told him about a book she had just finished, a novel about a woman who sailed across the Atlantic alone in 1897. Margaret said she admired women like that, women who did things people told them they could not do. Stone said he knew a few women like that. He did not say he was talking about her, but Margaret heard it anyway. The dinner started not long after. Every few weeks, Margaret making pot roast and biscuits in the kitchen on Elm Creek Road. The same kitchen Harold had built the shelves in. The same kitchen she had repainted by herself. 6 motorcycles parked out front in a row chrome catching the afternoon light. 6 rough men sitting around her dining room table, talking about road trips and old stories, while she refilled their coffee cups and laughed at jokes she only half understood. Tuck always brought dessert. Usually something from the gas station, a package of powdered donuts or a shrink-wrapped slice of pie that had clearly been sitting on a shelf for longer than it should have been. Margaret pretended to disapprove. She ate it anyway, every time. Dutch once showed up with flowers from a garden center, a bundle of yellow daisies wrapped in cellophane. He could not explain why he bought them except to say they looked like something she would have in her house. She put them in the blue vase on the windowsill, the one Harold had given her on their 25th anniversary. She left them there until they were gone, and then she left the vase on the windowsill after because it looked right there and she liked looking at it when she washed the dishes in the evening. Hatch, who still did not talk much, started bringing library books. He would show up with 2 or 3 paperbacks he had found at the thrift store in town and leave them on her porch without knocking. Margaret always knew they were from him because they were always mysteries, and they always had creased spines, and they were always exactly the kind of book she would have chosen for herself. She became what the club quietly, unofficially, unanimously adopted as their grandmother. No ceremony, no vote, no announcement. It just happened the way the best things in life happen, gradually and then all at once. The way a house becomes a home, the way a stranger becomes a friend. The way 6 men in leather and road dust became the family that Margaret Colton did not know she was missing until they were sitting at her table eating pot roast and arguing about football. The town of Whitmore County had always held its opinions about the Iron Wolf chapter. People crossed the street, mothers pulled kids closer, business owners watched carefully when the bikes rolled through. The leather and the patches carried a story that the town had written without reading the actual chapters. But slowly over months, then years, something in that story began to change. It changed in the small ways that small town stories always change, through details that travel from one kitchen to another. How they fixed Mrs. Whitfield's fence after the storm without her asking. How they sat with the Garner boy at the hospital when his parents could not get there in time and stayed until they arrived 4 hours without complaint. How Tuck spent 3 hours one Saturday helping an elderly man find his lost dog in the fields off Miller Road and refused to take a cent for it. How they showed up every single Tuesday at the Rusty Spoon just to make sure Margaret Colton was still sitting in her booth with her tea and her lemon cake and her brooch pinned to her collar. The leather and the patches did not change. But what people saw when they looked at them, that changed, slowly, the way all real things change. Not in a moment, not in a headline, but in the slow, steady accumulation of evidence that the story you told yourself about someone might not have been the right story. 5 years later, Margaret Colton was in the hospital. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. Her heart had simply done what hearts do after 94 years of beating. It asked for rest, the way a worker at the end of a long shift sets down his tools and sits, not with complaint, just with the quiet acknowledgement that enough has been done. Stone got the call at 11 at night, a nurse at Whitmore County General. She said Margaret Colton had been admitted that evening. She said Margaret had asked her to call one number, the only number saved in a prepaid phone she carried in her purse. By midnight, all 6 of them were in the waiting room. Boots on linoleum, paper cups of bad coffee, leather cuts draped over plastic chairs that were too small for men their size. They rotated shifts without being asked, without a schedule, without anyone organizing it. They simply showed up and they stayed, the way they had always showed up and stayed. When a nurse asked who they were, Tuck said it simply, without hesitation, without a single second of doubt. Family. The nurses did not ask again. On the last afternoon when the room was warm and still, and the light through the window was soft and golden the way Tennessee light gets in the late afternoon when the day is letting go, it was just Stone sitting quietly beside Margaret's bed. Her breathing was slow. Her hands were resting on the blanket. The brooch was pinned to her hospital gown because Claire had brought it from the house that morning, and Margaret had insisted. She said she did not go anywhere without Harold. She opened her eyes. She looked at Stone for a long moment. The kind of moment that exists outside of time. The kind where everything that matters is present and everything that does not matter falls away. She looked at him the way you look at something you want to memorize. Every line, every shadow, every detail. And she said in the same voice she had used in the diner 5 years earlier, calm and clear and utterly without fear, the words that Stone would carry for the rest of his life. I asked for a son for a day, and somehow I got 6 for life. Stone looked at the floor. His jaw worked. The muscles in his throat moved. He did not trust himself to say much. He had buried 2 brothers. He had done time at Riverbend. He had ridden through storms that broke trees and floods that swallowed roads. But this quiet room with this small woman looking at him with eyes that held no fear and no regret and no doubt, just certainty, just love, just the absolute settled knowledge that what had happened between them was real. This was the hardest thing he had ever sat through. He looked up at her, and he said the only thing he knew how to say, the thing that had always been true. From the very first moment she walked across that linoleum floor and stopped at their booth and asked a question that changed everything. "We protect family," he said. Margaret smiled, the real smile. The one that started in her eyes and worked its way outward until it filled the room, the way sunlight fills a room when you open the curtains in the morning. She closed her eyes. When they read her will, 3 weeks later, her children and her grandchildren gathered in the living room of the house on Elm Creek Road. The lawyer found a handwritten edition. Margaret's handwriting, steady and clear, dated 2 years before her death. She had left the house on Elm Creek Road to the Iron Wolf Motorcycle Club, the house Harold built, the house she had kept for 50 years, the garden she tended every spring, the porch swing, the bookshelves, the blue vase on the windowsill. One condition: every Tuesday, the house would open its doors to the elderly of Whitmore County. Tea and lemon cake, a place to sit, a place to be seen, a place where no one has to tremble alone in a corner booth because the thing coming for them is patient and polished and knows exactly how to use the system against them. Margaret Colton had protected herself, and then she had built something that would protect others long after she was gone. Not with money, not with lawyers, not with force, with a house, a table, an open door, and the unshakable belief that no one should ever have to stand up alone. Stone read the will standing in the kitchen where he had eaten pot roast 100 times. He read it twice, he folded it carefully. He put it in his jacket pocket. He walked outside and stood on the porch and looked down Elm Creek Road at the old oak trees and the quiet yards and the road that led to the Rusty Spoon Diner, where an 89-year-old woman in a floral blouse had walked across a linoleum floor and changed his life. He stood there for a long time. And when Tuck came out and stood beside him and asked if he was all right, Stone said the only thing that mattered: "We have got a house to take care of." The first Tuesday they made tea, they set out lemon cake on the same plates Margaret used to use. They opened the front door, and an old man from 2 streets over walked in and sat down at the table and said he had not talked to anyone in 4 days, and he just wanted to hear another voice. Tuck poured him tea. Dutch pulled out a chair. Hatch handed him a library book. And somewhere in whatever place exists beyond the last breath, in the last heartbeat, in the last golden afternoon in a hospital room in Tennessee, Margaret Colton was not surprised. She had planned for this too, because Margaret Colton planned for everything. And she never once, in all her 94 years, in all the rooms she walked into, and all the tables she sat down at, and all the moments that asked her to be brave, she never once stopped standing up.